Everybody, welcome to Help Me Understand, a podcast where we are looking for clarity through biblical conversation. This is, however you want to say it, either episode 10 or part 2 of episode 9. So
let's call it episode 10, part 2 of our end times.
That's right. Episode 10, part 2.
Now we've made it
end
to
times.
Double digits.
That's right. Welcome to... this is great.
Even though through the magic of technology, it's the same day we recorded.
Wow, that's amazing.
Episode 9.
I feel like we were just talking about this.
We're in the same clothes. You got your Super Rica shirt on today.
That's right. Yeah. So shout out to Super Rica, the best taco in the United States.
Super Rica in Atlanta and other places too. And I'm sure they're watching.
Yes, that's right.
But if so,
Thanks
all it would take
Super
to sponsor us is one
taco. Really low bar.
I was after the cheese on the plate. Okay,
so that's right.
The
boiled butter.
Gosh.
All right, but I digress. So last week in our last episode, we talked about some differing views on the millennium and how when we begin talking about the end and the end of times, it actually necessitates us talking about what's going to happen and in what order and who's it going to happen to. We walked through four differing views on when the millennium happens, if the millennium happens, and who's going to be around to have to deal with things. And ultimately, some of the questions are really just to sum up the difference between there being a importance of Israel and that being different from the church, or covenantal theology saying that there is one church in the New Testament, and so and that Israel is now just a picture of what the church would be in the New Testament. And then really just sort of saying, are things getting better? Are they getting worse? Or are we waiting on Jesus to make all things new? And so,
good summary. It's hard to think about these things. You got to put your brain on.
That's right. Put your thinking cap on, as my mom likes to say. Put your thinking cap on.
Yeah, and you could talk about this stuff for days, but it's hard to talk about it for 15 minutes.
Yes.
We can kind of limit. When we limit, what we're trying to do is reduce it down to some core questions, and then think about like what those core questions are, and then why it matters.
Yeah. So let's start here. So what do you believe? Where do you land?
I land in a amillennial camp.
Give me a tweet-sized version of why.
Yeah. So I see Revelation 20 as a picture of the intermediate state, and that what's happening consistently throughout the New Testament is this picture, and throughout the Old Testament in a prophetic way, this drawing everything to a close at the day of the Lord, which would be the day that Jesus comes back and sets up his kingdom on earth. So what we don't see is Jesus returning to rapture his church out. I don't see that. I see Jesus returning one time. Jesus has come once to earth, and the Bible speaks of a second coming. I'm not convinced by the argument that says that there's a partial coming, a coming on the clouds, and that's something different. I see it all as one language. When Jesus comes back, that's it. End of story. New heavens, new earth. All of this unfolds. Revelation 20. Satan is released, and there's a battle, and there's the great white throne judgment. Then new heaven and new earth. It just happens. It just unfolds.
Boom, boom, boom.
Like that.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think what else would be just kind of central to that argument.
No, that's good.
I just see that as the most consistent, simplest way.
Very fair summary.
To think about the end times.
Totally. So I have lots of respect for that view. And I think it's not just a good argument. I think it's really solid. It's a very biblical view. I would not land there personally. So I would land in the historic pre-millennial camp. Really just super quick, short summary is a very literal person, and so want to take some things a little more literally in those final chapters of Revelation. Thinking that there will, in fact, be a certain length of time because there's so much importance placed on just numerology in Scripture. But but I think that it's really possible for us to peacefully coexist and love each other, and it's good.
Yeah.
So, all right. So
Taco.
that's right. So one of the things that our engineer, we're going to call him our engineer from now on, Engineer Nick, was saying in the break was, it's really easy to think, why do I have to care about this? And I think that's a really honest and good point. That's a really good way for us to transition and saying, does this matter? And why? Is this just for you pastors to nerd out on some, eschatology, or like, how does this show up in my life?
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
Yeah, to just kind of close the last episode, I think where you think the world is headed is going to shape the way you live today. And so what's to come next is going to get filed away deep into the recesses of your mind and heart. And more and more as you even linger on that, meditate on that, and are aware of the reality of that, like the way that those things unfold ought to then drive you to live a certain way. That's the nature of the way that we think about truth from Scripture, is we become convinced of it, and we are then convicted by it, and we begin to live it out. So I think it matters in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. The way you share your faith, if you share your faith, why you sing certain songs, when we sing, it's really popular. It works its way into lots of worship songs about this idea of you're making all things new. Jesus is going to make all things better, right all wrongs, wipe every tear. There's got to be a reason we think that's a biblical thought. And so it changes how you worship.
Yeah, right. And there's not, like, all these nuances in that. We can certainly worship together. Right?
Yeah.
Like, we can see things differently
absolutely.
and worship together. But it lights a fire. Like, there's
it
a
adds
fire for
real
worship in
weight.
that.
Absolutely. So, and then I think as well, just an outlook on life, just a way to sort of preserve sanity is to at least have this back of your brain going, this is not all there is. So what I see and what my eyes and ears tell me is not all that exists or will ever happen. And so just knowing that there is more to the story. And so just general sanity has helped in that. So,
so we're continuing to feed. We still want you to ask questions. Okay, so beginning of the last episode, we asked for questions, and we would solicit those again at HMU at Arrowhead.Church.
Email us.
We're going to spend next week's episode discussing those questions. And so I just want to kind of inject one more, kind of prime the pump for those questions into the conversation. And that is to really kind of ponder this question, because it will have implications for the way that you live and the way that you read Scripture. So there is, because of our shaping in the dispensational premillennial view we spelled out last time. So chances are, if you grew up in church, around church, aware of these things in any way in the last 50 years, you've had your end times theology shaped by this view. So it's caused us to read Scripture through that lens and try to fit the pieces of the puzzle into that system. And when you see a breaking point around that system, it then, I think, kind of opens eyes to what can be possible. So just as a whole idea of whether you believe every piece of apocalyptic language in the New Testament is still to come in the future, or whether some of the things that were said have since already been fulfilled. So several years back, we spent 2 years preaching through the Gospel of Matthew, and where I really dug into some of these issues for the first time and even became convinced of amillennialism was we pressed go on chapter 1, and I knew 18 months from now, I was going to have to preach Matthew 24. So it's coming. It's a long time away. Right. It's a long book. But in Matthew 24, Jesus goes up on the Mount of Olives. It's typically called the Olivet Discourse. Jesus preaches this sermon, and he's interacting with the crowd around him, and they're asking him questions. So this passage of Scripture is one of the primary texts that we use to shape how we think about the end times. Right. When I believe now, having dug in deeper, I'm convinced of this, that much of what Jesus says here was already, it's already happened. So I remember titling the sermon, A Look Back at a Look Ahead. So like we are looking back on events, looking back on Jesus prophesying events that will take place now, I believe, much of which took place in the year AD 70, when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. And it was kind of the culmination of years of tribulation, there's a word, around for those early believers at the hands of persecution through the Emperor Nero at the time. So we know some of this history, but if you read Matthew 24, particularly the first, so I believe there's a breaking point along the way where he starts to look ahead, but you read some of this language, and then you see that some of these things, it appears, possibly have already happened.
Right.
All right, so verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, parentheses, let the reader understand. I love that when the Bible's just like, I know this is complicated. You know, Jesus says, I know this has got,
take a mental deep breath.
That's right. Yes. Then he says, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Well, what he's saying in the moment is when you see this figure who we would say is Antichrist. So now we can debate, is there an Antichrist figure, or is it like John wrote in 1 John, that up to this point, many Antichrists have come.
Right. The
spirit of the Antichrist is a spirit of opposition to Jesus, Antichrist. And some rise to the forefront and have abnormal influence and following to lead people away from Jesus. That happens historically over time. So could we be seeing something here that could take place? So throughout, in a couple different places in this chapter, Jesus says, this generation will not pass away before you see these things happen. Well, you either have to believe that what he means is, as he speaks to these people, this generation will not pass away before you see some of these things happen. Or you have to start going back to other passages of Scripture and other meanings potentially of the word generation and what he might have meant and how he was. So to me, like the plainest way to read it is Jesus just said, this generation won't pass away. And now we can look back at history and go, this sounds an awful lot like what we know happened throughout that time period.
Yeah.
And that's a long way to kind of dig into it. But it's crucial, I think. So we just see some of these details already unfold. Then that kind of leads to how you see the book of Revelation. Like, is everything in the book of Revelation sequential? Is it that once John starts talking, he sees this, then he sees this, then he sees this, and that means that this happens, and then that happens, and then that happens? Or is it just, because what he said was, then I saw this, then I saw this, then I saw this. It doesn't appear to me like he's trying to order the sequence of events. He's just saying, this is what I saw next.
Yeah.
So there are places at which, and I would say even this millennium, or this picture of the intermediate state is very similar to some of what you see in chapter 16. Like sometimes he's seeing different views, similar to what we would say in Genesis 1 and 2. So are there two creation accounts? No. In Genesis 1, we're seeing from cosmic view, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, and it's all kind of facts, right? Then chapter 2, here's this picture, and we see it kind of more from a ground view. We're not looking at it down from heaven. We're looking at it from the earth.
Yeah.
So, whether or not you're going to see Scripture through that lens, or is all the apocalyptic literature just future focused, then lets you take these passages and I think see them in a different light, as well as even some of the other passages in Thessalonians and
So we would say, just to quickly wrap us good.
That was
so
like a
good.
10-minute sermon.
I love that. We have used the phrase apocalyptic literature a number of times, and I feel like maybe it would be fair for us to go back and perhaps even define that for whoever's listening who may not have that category. So this is a way to look at or classify a certain section of the Bible. So you would say apocalyptic literature is not really, first of all, we don't write like that in our day and age, in our culture. No one writes in apocalyptic style. There's very little in terms of this is different from prophetic, but when we say apocalyptic, what we actually mean, the literal meaning of apocalyptic, is not the prediction of an event, it's to bring light. So an apocalypso would be to actually shed light on something. And so what John is doing in this genre of literature is attempting to shed light. That's why we know that John wrote this letter to believers, not necessarily just wanting to talk about dragons and mouths with spears and what tattoo does Jesus have on his thigh, but that there's also something that he wants to bring light toward by writing this letter to his friends and token. Really not just to a specific church, but to all churches. And so
that's right. So it shines light in, and then thinking with some of these categories I think helps us take a lens toward what we can now see and interpret events for today and events in the future in ways that are going to impact the way that we live even now. So you got all these questions. Maybe we could do some of this with the Q&A. What about what about the Antichrist? What is the beast? What about
is Nikolai Carpathia really the Antichrist? Is what all of our viewers and listeners want to know.
That's Left Behind reference. So the number 666 and the term the day of the Lord, and what was Daniel talking about when he said this in the Old Testament? So many of those questions that really get answered in part based on how you see the whole thing unfolding. So maybe there's some of those details that you might want to throw out. What does this mean? What does that mean? And we'll do our best to kind of rant on what we think around some of those subjects.
That's right.
Q&A episode.
So there we go. Thanks for listening. Again, send any questions, comments, helpful or not helpful critique to HMU at Arrowhead.Church. And again, subscribe. Anything else?
Rate,
review. Just let us know. Just tell us you like us.
And
it feels so much better if you give us 5 stars. It's so easy.
You gonna give that shirt away to the first?
Not a chance.
First. Okay.
All right. Thanks. See you next time.